Good morning. I bet you're probably wondering why I'm dressed like this. Well, it just so happens that something dawned on me as I was campaigning. I was walking around wearing suits, dressing in ways that really are not consistent with how I normally dress. And it became abundantly clear to me that there's a tendency for politicians to manufacture an image. And that image oftentimes is not really much of a representation of them. Although it may be. They may in fact just be a bunch of suits. Who knows? I can't really speculate on that. However, what I can tell you is that I'm not. And I felt a little bit bad about pretending to be. So what I found is that the more that the campaign has progressed, the more that I've gone away from the traditional political approaches, the more we've been receiving some pretty widespread approval. And it seems rather counterintuitive, because typically within the confines of politics, you're supposed to manufacture a certain type of image. You're supposed to behave a certain way. You're supposed to talk a certain way. You're supposed to give people empty platitudes, that sort of thing. And I realized pretending to be some guy in a suit probably doesn't suit me. And that's because I'm not wealthy. I'm not one of the 1%. I'm not getting a big fat stock portfolio by screwing you, the voter. And I just realized, you know what? Instead of videotaping me going around kissing babies, waving the flag, walking around wearing a tie, and shaking hands with a bunch of people that I don't really know, I realized that it was probably best to just shoot video of me doing what I do. This is how my day normally goes. Today I just happen to be changing my oil. As you can see, I ride a motorcycle. My wife does too. She's got her own, but unfortunately she's at work at the moment. But anyway, I'm bringing a lot of this stuff up because of the fact that it seems to me that most of the people that we are electing to office don't really represent us. And unfortunately, because they don't represent us, we aren't really getting people who have our best interests at heart. They're not one of us. They don't work for a living. They don't, and in my case, I actually work as kind of a handyman, because unfortunately, after graduating with a degree in criminal justice, I graduated shortly before all of the hiring freezes started coming through. And that pretty much prevented me from finding any sort of meaningful job in law enforcement. Oddly, I found myself highly critical of law enforcement throughout the entirety of my time that I learned about it at UH downtown, mainly because of the fact that there are issues with regards to police conduct, as well as the manner in which we treat our police officers and what police officers focus on. For example, the federal government has done a very good job of convincing police officers who were initially reticent about the war on drugs to prosecute the war on drugs with extreme efficiency, ignoring other problems. Like, for example, while the Reagan administration ramped up the war on drugs, they also defunded a great deal of focus on white-collar crimes. And it's rather unfortunate because it seems to me that a person who rips off a pension fund probably deserves a little bit more attention from law enforcement than someone who smokes a joint in the privacy of their own home. Now, call me crazy, but it seems to me that the latter would be a waste of government resources, whereas the former of the two would probably be a pretty good idea. Anyway, that brings me to an important subject. I think, as you may know, if you've followed my campaign, I've talked extensively about the war on drugs and what a waste it is. And what it comes down to is we are filling our prisons and spending lots and lots of money on something that could very easily be taxed and regulated so that we can pay for rehab clinics if necessary, as well as possibly even use it to fund schools in the same way that cigarette taxes have been used to supplement school funding. Now, it seems to me that this is a conversation that's not being had, primarily because of private interests being involved, like, for example, the pharmaceutical industry, which has played a strong role in influencing the decriminalization of marijuana, specifically because of the fact that they don't want a drug that's free, that they can't sell and patent, to be readily available, because of the fact that it might render completely obsolete some of their more dangerous antipsychotic drugs. Additionally, the private prison industry plays a role because of the fact that when private interests get involved in prisons, unfortunately, the capitalist model, which I applaud, sometimes can mix things up. Like, for example, with private prisons, we have the problem of the incentivization of creating repeat customers. And if there's one business that I don't want repeat customers in, it's prisons. So, that being the case, seems to me that it's time to end the war on drugs. Now, I'm sure that you're probably wondering exactly how I might go about doing that. The sheriff doesn't affect the law. The sheriff does affect policy. Now, Harris County Sheriff's Office is the third largest in the nation, and I suppose I probably should try a little bit harder on this oil filter. This is kind of funny. I seem to have tightened it a little bit. But anyway, as I was discussing the war on drugs, what this ultimately means is that there is a lot of money involved in politics, as we all know, and that means that I'm pretty much starting out as the underdog. I may be a people's candidate, but unfortunately the people don't typically donate hundreds of thousands of dollars to campaigns. So, what I've been doing is relying on $10, $20, $30 donations from people here and there. And it's caused us to ask some pretty valuable questions about whether or not we're spending our money wisely within the campaign. Now, the reason I say that is because of the fact that typically the conventional wisdom is that political candidates should send out mailers, that sort of thing. And when I sat down and realized how much it costs to mail a fancy postcard to 100,000 people, and that's not even a fraction of the number of people who reside in Harris County area, it's quite expensive. And what I've realized is the average person doesn't donate that sort of money. The only people who donate that sort of money are people who are expecting to buy a candidate because they've got lots of money, like, say, in the pharmaceutical industry. And because they've got lots of money, they want to pay to make sure that their interests are protected, even if those interests are directly against yours, like, for example, with the drug war. So, what that means is, if you get one of those postcards, for example, or if you see a big national campaign ad, it's because of the fact that these politicians are being paid not to represent your interests. And you should think about that the next time you get one of those flyers. It certainly will give you a little bit of perspective when you find politicians who are saying that they're tough on the war on drugs, which unfortunately is not really a productive thing to do. But on that, the sheriff has a great deal of control over policy and can dictate whether or not nonviolent drug arrests get prosecuted or even arrested in the first place. And it seems to me that the police force can be reappropriated to focus on actual crimes that do damage to people, rather than crimes that are mere technicalities due to an antiquated system that for some reason or another seems to have an issue with some things that some people do in the safety of their own homes. Now, I'm saying this, obviously, if someone is high and driving a car, I absolutely don't think that they have any business driving a car, and that should be treated appropriately. However, when someone is not harming anyone, when someone is not endangering anyone, while enjoying whatever it is that they enjoy, it seems to me that law enforcement has no place as long as they remain peaceful and nonviolent. It's when violence gets involved that I think we have issues. But in the meantime, my concern is with the law enforcement perspective, which is basically that we need to be administering justice rather than protecting the interests of a few small corporations involved in private prisons and pharmaceuticals. Because that does not necessarily correlate directly to justice. In fact, I'd say it's directly the opposite. Now going into these theoretical perspectives, I understand that you probably are wondering why the hell you're even paying attention to a sheriff's race. Because sheriff's races are about as interesting as races for comptroller, obviously. But it seems to me that the reason you're paying attention is because you've realized the same thing that I've realized, which is that the sheriff can actually impact a great deal of things, and more importantly, that when we vote for a legislator who, every once in a while we might find a legislator who might actually seem like they're good people, at which point we send them to Austin or we send them to Washington, and then they're drowned out by a sea of people who ultimately don't want to do the right thing. And the fortunate thing about the sheriff's department is that, yes, I do still have to deal with people, namely the commissioner's court. However, the sheriff has a significantly larger amount of power and is less likely to get drowned out by people who don't represent your interests. So, with that being the case, it seems to me that this can be a meaningful front in the war on drugs, at least in ending it anyway. With the sheriff's office, there are a lot of meaningful changes that we can enact on the local level. And while you probably know as well as I do that in a state that is as solidly loyal to a single political party as Texas is, your vote on the national level generally doesn't really have much of an impact. However, we tend to ignore local stuff thinking that it doesn't really matter, and it does. The truth is, when you've got ordinances like Mayor Parker's food sharing ordinance, when you've got issues like, say, programs like 287G and secure communities, which ultimately seem to be interested only in deporting people who have broken taillights, it seems to me that it's time to ask whether or not we really can change things on the local level, because it's my belief that we can, and this is where our votes can really have an impact. So, what I encourage you to do is to ask yourself whether or not you really feel like you've been empowered at the federal level by voting only for federal politics, or if you've been voting for local politics and you've followed this, then you know exactly what I mean. And this is where we can truly make a difference, because as it stands, we've got a great deal of opportunity to retake local politics, take the money out of it, and really reshape something for something that is more geared toward justice rather than simply providing protection for corporate elite. Anyway, that being the case, I want to thank you for listening to me babble as I change my oil, and hopefully I'll be making some more videos to talk about some of the other issues a little bit more in depth. But in the meantime, this is who I am.